So welcome everybody. So thank you for being here today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dan Hardy. He's the Grants and Awards Editor for the Faculty of Medicine here at the University of Toronto. And for 5 years, he's worked with writers from disciplines as diverse as anthropology and philosophy to history and the sciences to develop their writing skills and add clarity and persuasive force to their communication. What you need to know is he edits close to 100 grants a year and works one-on-one with faculty on their grant development. And he also develops strategies to improve the competitiveness of grants to organizations such as CIHR, CFI, Heart and Stroke, and other scientific funding agencies. So a lot of the places that we apply to. So welcome, Dan.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming out on such a nice day. So I can't make everybody a wonderful grant writer in an hour or 40 minutes or what do we have here. But what I can do and what I'm going to do today is talk about some habits of mind, ways of thinking about grants that good grant writers tend to have and that trainees don't yet have. So let's think about that. There's a handout. Does anybody not have the handout? I have a few more up here. Just raise your hand.
There's still some more on
There's
the
still
table.
some. Okay, there's still some more on the table too. Yeah, sure. And there's some at the table as well. Yeah, so there's a two-sided one-page handout, which for now you can just put aside. It's for the second half of my talk today. My talk has two halves. The first I'm calling the basics, although maybe I should say fundamentals, because I'm hoping it's not so basic that everybody already knows this stuff. We're going to talk about the basics of grant writing. And then in the second half of the talk, I'm gonna talk about the 5 top reviewer critiques of weak grant proposals. We're gonna be thinking today a lot about the reviewers, the people that actually adjudicate and assess grant proposals, and how they think, how they read, what they're gonna be looking for. And we're gonna walk through in the second half of the talk the 5 biggest pitfalls and how to avoid them. And that's when we'll turn to the handout. So no need for the handout right now. Dan, can you help me advance the next slide here? Go with that. Just click on that. So let's start with the basics. I have a couple slides here, and feel free to interrupt me anytime if you have any questions or want to make a comment. So I want to think about the various parts that compose a successful grant proposal. Sometimes this is called the proposal pyramid, and I've seen it as a triangle. But here I put it as 3 elements that go into, I don't know what that is, a funnel, I guess, and come out with a successful grant proposal on the other end. So often we have an issue where grants are rejected because the fundamentals are all wrong. So it doesn't really matter if the writing's good if we don't get these early steps right. So let's think about this for a minute. Getting not only just any project, but the right project, the project that the sponsor is actually interested in funding. So we're not thinking, when we think about writing, creating a grant proposal and submitting it, we're not thinking about our pet projects, the things we'd love to work on. We're thinking about the things that the sponsor actually wants to be funding. We're also thinking, and this is the purpley blue dot there, the PI, the team, are we the right person, or do we have the right team together to carry out this proposal? Right? There might be some project that we would love to get funded for and to do, but we don't have the expertise. Or we're junior and we simply haven't assembled a team to fill in the gaps in our expertise. And then finally the infrastructure, that one's obvious. You might want to do a project, but you might be in a situation where you don't have the lab at your disposal to be able to carry it out effectively. So before we even think about writing a grant proposal, thinking about getting these basic elements down, the basic components of your team, of the right project that's actually compelling and urgent and innovative and that actually aligns with the sponsor's priorities, and then finally having the infrastructure to actually carry out what you're proposing to do. So thinking about the basics, but when we set up a grant proposal. Secondly, again in the area of basics, thinking about the dichotomy between a scientific paper and a grant proposal. The way I like to think about them are as two different genres. Genres have certain, readers have certain expectations of genres. If you're reading a detective novel, you're going to expect that there's a crime at some point in the novel, right? You'd be surprised if there wasn't. Similar with these two forms of writing, there are certain expectations, there are certain structures and limitations that are placed on you as the writer in these genres, but then there's some freedom within them to explore, and we're going to talk about that today. So as trainees, as people moving into the sciences, I think it's really important to have this dichotomy in your mind and to understand inherently the differences between them and the way that you write. Of course, we know the basic differences, but let's think about the differences. One of the major ones is the way that a scientific paper is backwards facing in its text, meaning you're talking about work that you've already completed. And for some reason, because you know you've already done this and you've proven something, it's actually easier to write in that genre, in that format. It's a little more difficult to make the jump into the grant proposal genre where you're forward-facing. You're writing in a forward-facing way, and I use that phrase a lot in my comments to PIs. You know, you're switching between backwards-facing or forwards-facing, or here you need to only be forwards-facing, right? So there are some times where, say, where in a grant proposal might you be using backward-facing text? You'd be using it in the introduction where you'd be talking about preliminary data that you've already acquired, right? To demonstrate your bona fides, to demonstrate that you are the right person to undertake this proposal. You already have secured this preliminary data. That's backwards facing. But then you need to switch into that forward facing mode where you're saying, we will develop this therapeutic strategy if you fund us, right? And you need to have that future tense confidence and not that conditional tense, we may, we might, we could, right? We don't want that in a grant proposal. Of course, it's not definite that your ideas are actually going to come to fruition in a grant proposal, but you as the writer need to make that leap of faith. So backwards facing, forwards facing, that's one big difference. The next dichotomy here is expository versus persuasive. Scientists tend to be pretty comfortable in that expository mode in the scientific paper, where you're saying, we did this, then we did this, then it resulted in this, right? In the methodology section, if you're writing up your findings, it's a little more difficult, and it feels a little more foreign to be writing in the persuasive mode, where you almost have to sell your ideas, right? And we're going to get back to that. We're going to come back to that. How do you do that effectively? Another dichotomy. On the left, we're thinking about the scientific paper. The credibility of the findings is really what's at stake, what's being adjudicated. On the right, it's really the credibility or the expertise of the PI and the team that's being assembled, that's being adjudicated, in addition to the science itself. The next one, this is an important one, the dispassionate language on the left in the scientific article, whereas on the right in the grant proposal, you need to inject some excitement and urgency into your language. And I'm going to show you some examples of how that's done well. Because you're persuading a group of reviewers to fund you. And then the final element that I want you to remember and have in your head is specialized jargon. On the left, depending on what journal you're sending your manuscript to, it will be understood that you're speaking to people, your colleagues in a subdiscipline. You can use abbreviations. You don't have to explain in depth every single thing that you mentioned, because you understand that you're speaking to colleagues. With a grant proposal, you're still speaking to experts, but you're addressing a multidisciplinary audience. So you need to not alienate them by using jargon, abbreviations without defining them, or making assumptions in what they understand about your field, because oftentimes they won't. Okay. So, to sum up, I say the scientific paper is a genre for reporting past findings, and the grant proposal is a genre for reporting future actions. And it's those last words in the two descriptions that really matter. Findings versus actions. We will do this, right? And that's something that's hard to get used to. This is a bit of a silly slide, but there's a story behind it. Your grant proposal is your pitch. And I was talking with someone that I've been partnering with recently, Jeff Liu in epidemiology, on grant writing and grant development talks and trying to do more outreach to folks like you. And Jeff said to me, he said, isn't a good grant proposal a little bit like Dragon's Den, where you know that show, right, where you have to go on and give your pitch, and where you're speaking to other experts, other entrepreneurs on the show, if you're familiar with it, trying to sell them your idea, but you have to do several things. You have to convey excitement, don't you? You don't have to. You can't just describe some innovation that you want funded from the Dragon's Den. You have to contextualize it, put it in the context of that particular innovation, explain why it matters, and convey your own excitement and urgency toward another group of experts that may not feel any urgency or excitement about what you're particularly thinking about. So Jeff came up with this analogy, and we were kind of throwing it around saying, oh, that's pretty good. This might be a way to get people excited about thinking about a more dull subject like grant development and grant writing. But then we came up with this really interesting way that this is not, that the analogy breaks down a little bit. And this is important. Your grant proposal is a pitch without the chance for rebuttal and clarification. If you've watched the show, you know they sometimes say, oh, no, you misunderstood me, or let me start again, let me clarify. One of the really challenging things about good grant writing is that you don't have the chance to rebut until you resubmit at the next grant competition. But you won't have a chance to be in that room with the reviewers. So good grant writers are able to anticipate the dissent of the reviewers. How do they do that? They're able to anticipate questions and critiques by qualifying their claims. Here's one example. Here's one sentence. It is also possible that the double segmental units may merely reflect a continuous property. That's a hedging statement, isn't it? You don't even need to see it, you know. Where someone who's an experienced grant writer is hedging their bets, saying we're going to show that this is effective, that this is an effective strategy to solve X, and we want to be funded for it. But we know, we can anticipate that you're going to say, but what about this? We have an answer for that, right? So writing that response, that rebuttal or clarification into the grant proposal itself, you only get one chance to do it. And the number of times PIs write back to me and they say, I got this rejected, the reviewer totally grilled me in his review or her review, but clearly they just didn't understand my science, or they didn't understand the idea. The problem is the fault, that's on the PI to explain it clearly the first time and anticipate dissent, anticipate the kind of questions that are going to come up through qualifications and deeper explanations. Any questions so far? Okay, so staying on the basics, thinking about the basics, I want to go a little deeper into the idea of the reviewers. So often, trainees are interested in what really happens at CIHR or whatever agency or sponsor you're submitting to. What really happens? How many people will be reviewing it? Will they all be reviewing it at the table? And they forget the more important question, which is the thing they can actually control, which is thinking about how to write in a way that responds to how reviewers actually read grants, right? So I want to walk you through and try to get you into the headspace of reviewers. The first one that I want to talk about is the way that they're selective in their focus. Sometimes PIs spend way too much time on their methodology. Everybody's in love with their own science. That's everybody's comfort zone, and they forget about the fact that a lot of reviewers are going to be looking more at your summary, right, because they're busy, than they are going to be reading in depth your methodology over and over and over again. They may start reading a paragraph of your methodology, and then they might go to lunch. And then they'll come back, and they'll have to go back to your summary to remind them of who you are, or you might get bad luck. It might be early in the morning, and they're in a bad mood, or it might be late in the day, and they're tired. So thinking about how the reviewers actually read. One is that they're selective in their focus. Your summary is essential. It gets them back into the main stuff that you care about, the methodology, right? But don't expect them to be as obsessed with your methodology as you are. Another, depending on what opportunity you're applying to, remember that your summaries, your one-page summaries, are also sometimes used to slot you into the appropriate panel. So these are essential. You don't want to get stuck on the wrong panel because you've written a slapdash summary at the last minute. The second one, this is a really important one. What am I talking about? Always skeptical. What I mean by that is too many PIs write as if they're writing to a sympathetic audience, a generous reader, who will not be nitpicking, who will be understanding of minor spelling errors, or they will, a more generous understanding reader who will say, I didn't understand that paragraph. I'm going to start again, see if I can understand it a second go-round. That's not going to happen. You need to be writing in a way that to an audience that's skeptical of your science, skeptical of the idea that this even needs to be funded, that this is urgent, and skeptical of you yourself as someone who should be doing this project. You need to be writing in a way that's persuasive, and we'll talk about that. How do you persuade someone well? Sometimes distracted. So that reviewers who are also PIs, oftentimes we know that, depending on what hat they're wearing, could be in an airport lounge, right? Going through a pile of grant proposals that they've been asked to review by CHR. They might be half distracted. How as writers can we help them out? Can we help out a distracted readership? What we can do is we can start to add headings, key headings at certain points in the proposal. One of the most basic tips I can give you is simply to mimic the heading structure of the proposal instructions themselves. And then thinking about formatting, spacing. Is there a way that you can make it so it's simply more pleasant to the eye? Right? How can we help our reviewers out? Don't fill up the text all the way to the margins. Think about putting really important statements like your objectives or your goal in bold so that they can see it, so they can find it easily. Help your distracted reviewers, imagine they're distracted, try to help them find your information really easily by using what I call judicious styling. So bold, italics, underline, but not throughout the whole thing, not everywhere. Very selectively to draw their eye, just like the way that I'm drawing your eye by having this turn into red text, right? I can control where your eye goes. Try to think about strategies, usually involving stylistic elements, where you can try to control the reviewer. We've said some of them. Using bold selectively for major elements. Putting the most important points at the beginning or the end of paragraphs. Using I statements or we statements. We will show, right? Scientists tend not to use the first person, right? Tend to write in passive voice because what matters is the experiment, the stuff, not the scientists themselves in a proposal, but selectively saying, our team will show, our team will prove, right? Draws the eye. And I'll come back to that. I'll come back to an example of that. Okay, I want to move into, and any questions so far? I want to move into the second part where we jump into some actual examples. And we look at some problems and we look at how they might be fixed. Okay. So this is where we're going to look at our handout. So make sure you have a handout. So what I've done here is I have the top 5 critiques that reviewers make. One of the most important resources you have as a PI is reviewer comments. And the best reviewer comments you can get, the richest ones in terms of improving your writing, are negative ones. So what I've done here is I have 5 slides. This is the first one. And I've actually pulled a direct quote from an actual reviewer from a recent rejected grant proposal. And on each slide we have a different quote. On the handout, we have an example of really good writing that ameliorates the problem we're going to discuss on the slide. Okay, everybody with me? Okay. So I won't read through you can read the one sentence on the slide yourself. For what goes wrong. What do I mean when I say infeasible? What I mean here is good grant writers balance ambition with feasibility. It's a fine balance, ambition versus feasibility. All sponsors want to see you being ambitious and innovative and cutting edge. Everybody loves those terms, right? But the real truth is that Canadian granting agencies are actually fairly conservative. They don't actually want you to propose something that maybe will succeed. They pretty much want it guaranteed that it will succeed if you're getting funded. So it's a very fine balance between demonstrating and using the language of innovation and impact and being cutting edge, while also, on the other hand, showing them that this is actually feasible, especially feasible within the 5-year window or whatever it is of the grant. How do you do that? How do you allay the concerns of a review panel that you can actually do what you're proposing within the timelines and that you have the expertise and the team together to do it? You do that by providing concrete details about the timeline, milestones, and emphasizing that you have preliminary data in hand. There's a big difference I see between PIs that use a lot of cliched language in their writing. I promise that this will be groundbreaking, this will be innovative, I have the expertise to do this, and actually proving it or demonstrating it through concrete examples. So let's take a look at the first paragraph here. We'll call it sample text number 1. This is an example of a PI that's doing a really good job of showing the reviewers that he has everything lined up to be able to actually succeed and has been thinking about the timeline, not just about the exciting project that he wants to get funded, but actually showing how it can actually be done within a certain limited amount of time. I'll read through some of it at least with you, just follow along with me. Proposed timelines and milestones. We expect completion of AIMS 1.1 to 1.3 within year 1 of the grant. We already have functional AAV vectors for these experiments, and graduate student John Smith is completing these experiments. We are preparing a manuscript describing the work. AIM 2 will be completed in years 2 to 3 of the grant by graduate student John Smith, Jane Doe, and a postdoctoral fellow, Linda Johnson. What do we see so far? We see that the aims, which are just they're the backbone of your proposal in a grant proposal. The backbone, the skeleton of it, is your objectives or aims. There's usually 3 of them, 3 things you want to get done in the period of the grant. And we see that here they've been connected to a timeline. That's essential, and it's not always explicitly written out by the agency, by the sponsor, that you need to do this. But good grant writers do this. They connect aims to a timeline. Let's look at the last sentence here. You can see the way that we've also, the writers also helped out these reviewers who might have tired eyes, right? So I went to another grant talk and someone used that phrase and I've loved it ever since, that you're writing to people with tired eyes. The writer here has put the years in bold. So you can easily see that all 5 years of the grant are covered. This is someone who's covering all their bases. The last sentence, peptide development is an ongoing process. We have experience in this area and are confident we can translate our findings and achieve our aims within the 5 years of the grant. See Gantt chart figure 1. I love that last line. It's just one little extra reassurance that this This team has all their ducks in a row, right? And then we also have that Gantt chart. There's a visual figure that I haven't included here, obviously, that complements, that supplements the text. Think about figures. I encourage you to include figures in your grant proposals. Make sure that they supplement, add to the text that you already have, rather than just repeating what you have. Don't make them redundant. So this is the first example. This is how you demonstrate feasibility, right? Not only is this project ambitious, it's also feasibility. It's also feasible, and it aligns to the timeline of the sponsor opportunity itself. Okay, let's move on to number 2. Any questions? Okay, number 2. So the second top critique from reviewers for rejected grant proposals, and I'll let you read the critique. Okay, so there's the critique, incohesive. How could that happen? How could it happen that you work so hard on a grant proposal and then the reviewers think it's incohesive? How does that happen? It's because we tend to work on the different pieces at different moments. And you can fall into this trap of starting to see them as discrete pieces of writing. You can work on the summary, then you work on the methodology, then you might work on the benefits to Canadians section if there is one, maybe an HQP training section if there is one. Maybe you're working on the introduction, and all these pieces you've forgotten to synchronize them at the end, right? To make sure they all cohere, and you end up with this incohesive proposal. So I was reviewing one recently. This is a true story, and the PI had 4 aims in her summary. It's important to make the aims flow all the way through the proposal, and I'll show you an example of that. So she was right about coming back to the aims over and over again. But the problem was when she had 4 aims in her summary, she had 3 aims in her introduction, and she had 3 different aims, or slightly different, in her methodology section. This was not good, because it looks sloppy, it doesn't cohere, it just confuses the reviewer. How did it happen? It's very obvious. We all have this. As she was writing the grant, her ideas were changing. Her ideas were evolving regarding what was actually feasible, what actually could be accomplished in the time period, what her team actually wanted to do, what mattered for translation, for impact. These were changing. She was thinking in real time. She was doing that innovative, creative work. The problem was it showed in the grant proposal itself. No reader, no reviewer wants to see the evolution of your thought. They want to see the pinnacle of your thought, the end of your thought, your thinking. So making sure all those sections cohere. So let's take a look at our example. How do we emphasize the coherence, the cohesiveness of our proposal to a grant reviewer committee? So often we need to signal things to a committee, but we need to do it implicitly. We can't say explicitly, I am innovative and I deserve to be funded, right? How do we imply? How do we tacitly say things that we need to express to our review committee? Let's take a look at how it's done in aim number 2, or in sample number 2 here. Building on our preliminary research, my team is now poised to address the following aims to discover and validate novel causes of multiple genetic diseases. Aim 1, expand our binding site resolution human molecular interaction network to improve our ability to find genetic causes of disease. Aim 2, develop novel methods to predict how mutations affect cellular mechanisms and cause disease using the expanded network. Aim 3, apply our innovative methods to all available disease-linked mutation data and experimentally study novel disease mechanisms we identify. What do I like about these aims? They all begin with a verb. They're all very, very short. If a reviewer sees them, he or she can walk away and remember them. That's a test of whether you've written a good, succinct aim. And notice that each one builds upon the previous one, right? Aim 1 was to expand a network. Aim 2 is to use this expanded network to develop novel methods. And aim 3 is to apply these new methods, these innovative methods, to disease-linked mutation data. Okay? So each one builds upon the previous one. This is a gain-loss scenario. It's a gain because it demonstrates that all of these aims are cohesive. They all belong under the umbrella of this one project. Let's say it's a CIHR project grant, that's probably where I got it from. They all deserve to be funded simultaneously through this one grant. We're showing that to the review panel because they echo, they build upon one another. What's the potential pitfall of this strategy? A reviewer might say, well, what if you aren't able to achieve aim 1? How are you ever going to do aim 2? Or what if aim 2 has a problem? Well, you're never going to get to aim 3. So what does a good grant writer do? They anticipate that dissent. We've already talked about that. They anticipate the dissent of the review panel, and they add a contingency plan, right? Contingency and mitigation strategies. Sometimes a sponsor will ask you to explicitly include a section called that, contingency and mitigation plan or strategy. Other times they won't, but good grant writers add it there anyway, find space for it. You're covering your bases. You're making sure they can't critique you on that. So then I put an ellipses in brackets there. So skip down, imagine we're skipping down in this sample grant. And we get into a program expert section. And here we have an interdisciplinary team. I'm down the bottom of the first page of the handout. An interdisciplinary team of world experts with complementary skills has been assembled to help this research team program succeed. Most of them are located in the same building as our lab. The collective breadth and depth of the expertise on this team is outstanding and among the best internationally. Allaying all the fears that you don't have the right team together. Nope, you do. And here is the team, here it comes. And notice that it's all broken down into certain activities that the different team members will be doing. And I've given you one bio. In this grant, I would imagine there might be 8 to 10 co-PIs that will be working on it from across Canada. Notice, and the thing, we don't have to read through it, but the thing I want you to take away from this is even in the latter parts of this grant proposal, it's still structured by the aims, right? Dr. Linda Johnson here from U of T, I've changed all the names to protect the innocent of the failed grant proposals. She's only responsible for aims 1 and 3, right? And then presumably there would be other co-PIs who would be responsible for the other components of the program or of the project. So making those aims carry all the way through the grant, implicitly demonstrates cohesion. Okay, let's move on to number 3, lacking innovation. You can tell the reviewer here was just fed up with this particular approach. Yeah. So one thing I want to say here is a bit of maybe an asterisk, a little bit of an aside, is that increasingly we're noticing that sponsors and PIs themselves are shifting to talk more and more about impact rather than innovation. So I think we're at a pivot point where you're going to see in the next few years sponsors increasingly ask you to demonstrate impact, which is an umbrella term for innovation and translation and outreach and all of that good stuff. How do you demonstrate innovation? One strategy grammatically, or in terms of at the sentence level, is to use a they say, I say sentence. It's very simple. It simply is a sentence that goes something like this. While other experts in my field have done X, I plan to do Y. They say, I say. While other people have said this, I will say that. When I notice that a proposal doesn't demonstrate how it's significant or innovative, I sometimes just add the skeleton of that sentence into their draft itself and say, please complete this. Now you can't have these kind of sentences throughout your whole proposal, but it's something to have in your arsenal that can be deployed strategically. So let's take a look. Number 3 in the handout on the back, at the top of the back page. how do we talk about innovation in a way that doesn't sound cliched and that's actually persuasive? Well, we might consider adding a paragraph with a bold heading that says significance and originality. Now, that actually wasn't, the grant that I drew this from with permission wasn't, didn't have a section that said, please talk about significance and originality. The PI came up with that as a heading. Why did she or he add that heading in bold? To draw the eye of the reviewer, because he or she knew that a reviewer will always be thinking about that. Okay, you haven't demonstrated how this is original yet, you haven't demonstrated how this is significant. So simply add it for them. Do the hard work of their searching through your 10-page proposal for them. So let's take a look at what that might look like. Significance and originality. Understanding pathogen evolution is critical for comprehending and predicting how changes to a pathogen impacts host health. While this topic is widely studied, few labs address the challenges of pathogen evolution utilizing a range of scientific approaches simultaneously. My laboratory will apply biochemical, genetic, genomic, and evolutionary techniques that will be synergistic and complementary to each other, developing mycosporidia and a powerful model to study pathogen evolution. The requested microscopy infrastructure will be truly multifunctional and versatile. To my knowledge, very few labs in the world have access to such an advanced microscopy system, and even less have direct access. What do I like about this? So, as far as I can tell, he never used the word innovative, right? That increasingly it seems like a cliche. Instead, he or she showed how it was innovative by using they say, I say formulations, right? While other people have done this, I'm doing this, right? So implicitly, you're demonstrating your innovativeness. Okay, let's go to the next one since we don't have tons of time. Insignificant. Okay. So how do you demonstrate significance? You need to provide context for a multidisciplinary audience. PIs are too close to their own research, and they start to forget why it all matters, right? So one of the questions I like to go back to is this big one, so what? Why is what I'm working on important? Right? Go back to basics and think about why it matters beyond your own discipline, but beyond your own sub-discipline. I want to show you, and if you've seen me talk before, you know this is one of my favorite paragraphs of all time. Number 4, how do we demonstrate significance? We do it by what I call leveraging emotion and data. Really, really hard for trainees in the sciences to make the leap to bring in some excitement, some urgency through emotive language, because everybody's been taught to only use data, to focus on the quantitative, right? How can you possibly blend these two? They seem like oil and water. But I want to show you a really great example of grantsmanship from, this is the chair of molecular genetics, Leah Cowan, and she's a grant master, and she generously let me show this with all of you. Here's an opening from a recent grant of hers. This is the opening. So this language wouldn't be appropriate in a methodology section, but it's very appropriate in a summary when we want to grab everybody's attention and show them the context and why it all matters. So here it is. She works on fungi. Fungi have a devastating impact on human health. They infect billions of people worldwide and kill over 1.5 million per year. The most vulnerable are immunocompromised individuals, including those undergoing chemotherapy or transplants, and those infected with HIV. The frequency of invasive fungal infections has increased by over 200% in recent years. With the surge in immune deficiencies, these infections impose a major public health burden with more than $10 billion in treatment costs and mortality rates of 30 to 90%, depending on the pathogen and the patient population. Candida species account for 88% of all hospital-acquired fungal infections in the United States. In Canada, they are the 3rd most prevalent cause of bloodstream infections in hospitalized patients. Candida auris is an emerging pathogen that has been classified as a serious global health threat by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It is spreading rapidly and is resistant to all antifungal drugs. What do I like about this? Why do I think this is really impressive? Again, as a summary paragraph or as a paragraph in the introduction of a grant. Look at the way she's able to bring in emotional impact, to pull us in, again, going back to that Dragon's Den analogy, get people excited about your topic. Maybe your review panel's not that excited about fungi, but all of a sudden, we are by the time we read this. What does she do here? She has tons of data points, doesn't she? She has tons of quantitative, of numbers. She has footnotes, but she also has language that we wouldn't necessarily think of using in a grant. The first line, fungi have a devastating impact on human health. Rather than using terms like pathogenic, right, or negative, she uses a term that's emotional, devastating. And then I want to look at the end of that paragraph. What I always say is that a trainee probably would have ended the sentence at the word prevention. Candida auris is an emerging pathogen that has been classified as a serious global health threat by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, period. But because she's so incredible, she has such advanced grantsmanship skills, she adds a semicolon. And she adds a sentence, a full clause, that really sounds like it's out of a tagline for an action movie, right? It is spreading rapidly and is resistant to all antifungal drugs, right? She does this wonderful job of bringing in the urgency and the excitement, which is mandatory in a good grant proposal. But she couples it with the data that's necessary to demonstrate expertise. It's amazing. Okay, the last one, confusing. Thinking about confusing language. This is something I deal with day in, day out as an editor. I'm sure you can imagine. What are my very simple tips? Put clear subjects and clear actions close together. Simple as that. Put clear subjects, either we, meaning the team, or Candida auris, whatever you're working on, the subject. Put it really, really close in the sentence with the verb, the action. Put clear subjects and clear actions next to each other in sentences. That's what makes for a clear sentence. You'll notice that scientific writing, because you constantly have to add lots of modifiers, can get really difficult and to read because the verb gets really far away from the noun. So if you flip back on your sheet real quick, and I know we're running out of time, if you look at aim 1 on number 2 on the first side of the handout, we'll go backwards a little bit here. Aim 1 says expand our binding site resolution human molecular interaction network to improve. We finally get to the verb. There's too many nouns there, aren't there? Why? Because the PI is making sure they describe this network perfectly, but the PI's forgotten that the more descriptive you become, the less clear you become. Because you need more nounal phrases, and it gets your subject further away from the verb. So very, very simply, put your subjects near your clear actions. Second tip, make the first sentences in your paragraphs the most important sentences in the paragraphs, and make them describe everything else that's going to happen in that paragraph. Topic sentences. So let's take a look at that. This is my last example on the back at number 5. And I have a before and an after. So this is a paragraph that I edited. It's a vision statement, which oftentimes does appear in a proposal. And let's look at the before. This is the original, and then we'll look at how I revised it. Vision. The hypothalamus controls our physiology through a complex network of neuroendocrine cell types. Specific neurons can be targeted for therapeutic interventions using our innovative combination of discovery, research, novel technologies, and translational expertise. By defining cell-specific signatures and unique functional dynamics of each neuron, targeted therapies can reverse the imbalance of homeostasis causing hypothalamus-mediated disease. one thing to say, it sounds okay to our ear, doesn't it? But there's a lot of problems with this paragraph. What are the problems that I see? One big problem is topic sentence. That first sentence that should be the most important one and tell us everything about this paragraph. What's the most important thing in the vision statement? It's your vision, right? It's not the definition of what the hypothalamus is. So notice that. The text sounds okay when you read it, but when we think about structural elements, where things go hierarchically, the hierarchy's all messed up. So let's take a look at how I change it. Real quick. Our overarching vision is to define cell-specific signatures and unique functional dynamics of each neuron in the hypothalamus. Next sentence, the hypothalamus controls our physiology, right? So first give us the vision, then you can define the technical terms. Not that hypothalamus is really that technical, but then you can define the terms that you've used in that previous sentence. Notice also, I've added subjects here and actions. We will do this. Our team will achieve this. Notice how they're absent in the before. Do you see that? So how do we get rid of confusion? We put key parts of a sentence where readers expect to find them. Nouns at the beginning, then actions, and then followed by a result. A good sentence is like a mini play. Someone comes on stage, does something, and then something happens. So I've changed it by putting the most important sentence first, and by adding clear subjects and clear actions that the subjects take. That's how we can take care of confusion. I think that's everything I have for you. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions in 10 minutes or so. I'll give you some time to digest all the new information. Yep.
Thanks for the nice presentation.
Sure.
So in the second, what do you call it, bullet point?
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
So you talked about the fine line between, what you're proposing and what if it fails, right? So is it a good idea to talk about this contingency plan? Like some projects, especially let's say technological projects, where maybe straightforward, may not fail as such, maybe, but the eye may not know if they fail. If you want to do some analysis, just trying to find some correlation.
Yeah.
If you don't find it,
Yeah.
so how to write those kind of things which you're not sure of?
Yeah, so the question, and I'll repeat the questions for people online and for anybody who can't hear it here. The question is when and to what extent and how do you know when you should add those qualifications about how you're balancing ambition and feasibility, those hedging statements. And you're exactly right. There's a certain point where it would be absurd because by definition, every grant proposal is a bit of a gambit. Right? It's a bit of a gamble. We don't know that this will actually be achievable. We don't know that the team will find what we say we find. And the very nature, by definition, of things that might come up that need to be mitigated is that they're unpredictable. So you're exactly right. You're really signaling, again, implicitly to the reviewers that you have anticipated certain potential problems coming up. And it's not worth bringing that up unless you have a contingency plan in place. So it's not worth saying, I know that all of this might go wrong, unless you are able to say, and we have a backup plan B, C, and D that can take care of things. So you're exactly right. All of this is a bit of an intellectual exercise. It is a bit mythological in the sense that there's no guarantee that every grant proposal is going to result in aims A, B, or 1, 2, and 3 being achieved. But yeah, so it's a bit of demonstrating that you are an expert at grant writing to show that you've covered your bases. Other questions? Yep.
Do you recommend that with grant proposals, as with, for instance, papers, the presentations that trainees give, that they practice, that they share, for instance, with colleagues who are a little bit out of their discipline, so they can get that perspective of, someone who isn't as close to your research? Is that something that you think provides value?
Definitely, absolutely. And the only way to really become a good grant writer is that iterative process. And one of the things that we didn't bring up today is that what I call iterative resilience, that good grant writers, unfortunately, our success rate's around 13% for the project grant. Actually, U of T is a little higher than the national. That's the national success rate. So iterative resilience, being able to know that you're probably not going to get funded, and to be able to use that reviewer feedback as a really rich resource to then grow during the next attempt. But certainly the best way to become a good writer in any genre is just to write and to keep writing and to have other people read it and critique it, and asking them not only, do you understand my science? Do you think my science is legitimate? Do you think this is feasible? But also, were you excited by it? Was it clear? Do you think that my ideas are urgent? Do you think that other people, aside from me and my few very close colleagues, think that this actually needs to be funded? And then trying to get other people to help you brainstorm. How is it going to benefit other people in the world? It might be a little easier in the rehabilitation field to think about translation to the wider community than it is in basic science. But you still sometimes need to brainstorm a little bit. What is the economic impact? What is the social impact? What is the environmental impact? And what is the impact on health services and how they're distributed to everyday Torontonians or Canadians? So absolutely use your colleagues as sounding boards and get them to give you really good feedback, and get critiques from outside of your home discipline, so you can try to recreate that multidisciplinary atmosphere. Yep.
Can you tell the maximum length, how lengthy should be like?
Length? Okay. So we'll talk about length constraints for a minute. So length constraints are definitely a challenging part of a grant proposal. And all the time I have PIs send me their grants and they say, here it is, it's all set, except every section is 4 pages too long. So then it's my job to cut it down, which I do. But the reason I don't talk about formatting and length constraints is because every opportunity is different. Every sponsor is different in what they permit. But the real thing to think about there when I'm doing brutal cutting is what's essential for the actual proposed project. Too often people get caught in the weeds of describing some of the science that they love because they know they can articulate it in language on paper well, but it's not really that apropos to the proposed project. And what people usually get carried away with when it comes to length constraints is they talk too much about preliminary research. It's enough to simply give a quick discussion of your preliminary data that you've already acquired and how it's connected to the proposed project. You don't need to go into it at length. And that goes back to that original basic point I was calling it about backward-facing and forward-facing text. My guess is that I don't work with a lot of trainees on grant writing, but my guess is that the more junior people are, the more they tend to be comfortable in that backward-facing format of writing where they're talking about things they've already done. And usually when I'm cutting, I cut that, give a little bit of the preliminary data, and then mostly I want you talking in forward-facing future tense because that's what a reviewer is going to be looking at. Checkbox, checkbox, checkbox. Are they going to be able to do this? Yes. Are they going to be able to have the right team? Yes. Will they be able to carry this out in AIM 1, 2, and 3 in 5 years? Yeah. A little less interested in the background preliminary data. Once you simply say and give some evidence of here's the paper that I published, here's the footnote to it, the reference to it, and here's my team, and I've studied under this person, I work with this person, you're good to go. So that's where I do the cuts. Too much backward-facing text. Yep.
Could you talk a little bit about appendices? How are they treated by a review panel?
Like references?
Well, and figures.
Oh yeah, sure.
Is it really bad if you don't include appendices, even if the grant is not explicitly calling for it?
Okay, so the question is about figures, appendices, references, and how much they matter. So oftentimes, again, this is going to come down to the different sponsor rules. Oftentimes sponsors will allow you one extra page beyond the 10 pages, for instance, for references, and sometimes they'll allow you to attach figures as well. My suggestion is if they don't give you extra space for references, don't overload your proposal with references. So a GELF, a CFI GELF, which is an infrastructure grant, so you can get stuff for your lab. They are notorious for not allowing an extra page for references. That's an instance where you don't want to use precious space to to use references. So you need to cut back on your references. Figures. I think figures are really essential. I like them embedded. I prefer them embedded in the text. And sponsors sometimes permit that and sometimes don't. Usually has to do with formatting and the way they print them off and the way it can mess up the formatting of the text when they say put figures in the appendix. But my preference is to have them embedded so it's easier for the reviewer. We always want to think, how can we make the reviewer's life easier? I think they're essential. They're not. They are supplementary, but they're not unnecessary. Figures really help clarify complex things, particularly processes. So if you're talking about the way a cell, I don't know, the way mitochondria work in a cell, and there's 3 steps, step 1, 2, and 3, that can be beautifully demonstrated with a figure, 3 different pictures with an arrow demonstrating progression. That's the kind of thing you want to capture in a figure that is just laborious and difficult to capture in text. So I hope that's helpful. I see figures as central to a really good proposal. I see references as the kind of things you want to cut down on if it's part of your core 10 pages. Yeah. Yep.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Is it reasonable to write a grant proposal for a completely new idea or to have some groundwork done?
Okay, the question is it reasonable to write a grant proposal with a brand new idea, or is it important to have groundwork done? My understanding, and again, you'll want to speak to more senior PIs to get their take on it. My understanding is it's pretty crucial to have preliminary data already under your belt, and that goes back to that first slide of the 3 different elements, the proposal triangle or proposal funnel or whatever we want to call it. That to demonstrate to the reviewers that you're the right person to take on this project. It's pretty important to show that you've done some work in it to show that this is an effective strategy or an effective approach, and that you have the expertise to carry it out. So usually 99% of the time it opens with a good grant opens with the context, with what others have done, and then what they have done. That's what I look for, that's what I expect in an introduction to a grant. Any other questions? I know we're almost out of time. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for coming out. It's been fun.